Policemen, what's the absolute worst crime scene you've seen? Friend's dad works as a cop. This happened during a terrible ice storm a few years back. Out in the country, a good 15 to 20 minutes from any town, down a road that hardly sees any traffic. He got a call from a woman worried about her mom. They talked every day, so something felt off. When he arrived at the address, he spotted a truck sitting by the gate. He got out to investigate, but there was nothing to see in or around the truck. So, he decided to keep walking. That's when he found her. The old lady was by the mailbox, having fallen into a puddle, and she had frozen over. It took the fire department to burn her out. After making that call, he walked up to the house. The door was slightly ajar, so he announced himself, but there was no response. As he explored inside, he stumbled upon the horrifying sight of her husband. He had died staring out the window at her. Condemned to a wheelchair, he hadn't had power for a week or a cell phone to call for help. He had perished watching his beloved freeze to death just beyond the glass. That's a tough situation. It's a tragic story all around. You have someone who needed help but couldn't reach out, and then the husband had to go through that alone. That ice storm really made things worse. It's a reminder of how quickly things can go wrong when help isn't available. Definitely a heavy moment for that cop dealing with all of it. It was Halloween night, and the campus was alive with a notorious party that drew crowds from all over town. The atmosphere was chaotic, filled with laughter and the scent of pumpkin spice wafting through the air. But beneath it lay an edge of tension. The police, donned in riot gear, patrolled the streets, met with cheers and playful jests from party-goers who thought they were just there for the show. Then, a call shattered the night, a fight breaking out at a house party. Officers pushed through throngs of drunken revelers, their shouts masked by the music and laughter. They were making their way to the commotion, but by the time they reached the scene, the true horror was unfolding just next door. They turned just in time to see one kid shove another onto the street, right in front of a speeding tow truck. The sickening sound still echoes in their minds. The thud, the splatter, the instant transformation from life to a gruesome scene. In that fleeting moment, the laughter faded into screams, and the party turned into a nightmare. The kid who had pushed him didn't just lose his friend that night. He lost his own future, charged with involuntary manslaughter, forever haunted by the moment he chose violence over restraint. Halloween was never the same in that town again. That's a pretty intense story. Halloween parties can get wild, but it seems like things went way too far this time. It's crazy how quickly a situation can turn dangerous. That kid's life is probably ruined now, and the other family's dealing with a huge loss. Just shows that you should be careful about your actions, especially in moments like that. Not just a fun night for everyone involved. I was just a volunteer, hoping to earn my official title soon. A few months ago, I got a call about someone who had jumped in front of a train. I suspect it was intentional, but nobody really knows for sure. And honestly, I haven't had the guts to look it up. They said the woman had her legs severed, and her stomach was caved in, like those cartoons where the character gets flattened against the road. But this was far worse. Her insides were spilling out, bursting through different wounds from the pressure. After that, they offered me the chance to go home, but I chose to stay. As the day dragged on, some guy shouted at us, calling us good-for-nothing pigs. It hit me then, people are so quick to judge, completely blind to what we actually face. I was still so new to this world. It was a day I wouldn't forget, a day that still haunts me. That sounds like a pretty rough experience. It's tough seeing things like that, especially when you're new. People often judge without understanding what's really going on. Staying on after such a scene shows some dedication, even if it was a challenging choice. Hopefully, you get that official title you're aiming for. Hang in there, it's a hard job, but it can also be meaningful. I was wandering through the twisted streets of Tokyo, lost in thought, when I hit a train crossing. A small crowd had gathered, their faces a mix of indifference and curiosity as the train barreled toward us. Then I noticed a man, a salaryman in his 50s, dressed in a rumpled suit. He turned to me, a finger pressed to his lips, signaling for silence. It was eerie, like he knew something I didn't. And before I could process it, he leaped in front of the oncoming train. Everything unfolded in a heartbeat, as if time had warped. One moment he was there, his gaze locked onto mine, and the next he was gone, swallowed by the relentless metal beast. The image haunts me to this day, an unsettling reminder that life can change in an instant. He seemed so ordinary, just a man heading home from work. But that casual demeanor masked something far darker, something I still can't comprehend. That's a pretty intense story. It's strange how moments like that can stick with you, even when you don't fully understand what happened. The contrast between his demeanor and the action is something you don't forget easily. It's a reminder of how unpredictable life can be, especially in a place like Tokyo where so much is happening all the time. You just never know what someone else is going through. It wasn't supposed to happen. I just happened to stumble into something I could never unsee. My neighbors were always the odd ones. Aloof grandparents, a daughter twisted by her demons, and her little girl who I used to watch after school for free because they struggled. Just a quarter of a mile down the street, it was their usual chaos. One day, as I was walking home with the girl, who was barely 9, I caught a glimpse of her mother's shadowy figure slipping in and out of sanity. She had a boyfriend, a man whose darkness matched hers. I waved goodbye and watched as the girl stepped into their apartment. Moments later, a deafening gunshot broke the evening calm. Panic erupted. My parents rushed to the scene, voices filled with confusion and fear. I was too curious to stay back, but they tried to shield my eyes. In the brief chaos, I caught a horrific sight. Blood splattered against the wall, remnants of a life lost. It turned out her mother's boyfriend had been waiting, a gun in his trembling hand. When the girl and her mother walked in, he ended it all, right in front of them. I saw the girl only once afterward, a broken spirit clinging to the shadows of her childhood. No one should have to experience that. And the officers? They were left to piece together the fragments of that nightmare. This is a pretty heavy story. You inadvertently got involved in a tragic situation that no one should have to witness, especially at a young age. It's tough to process such events, especially for the kid who experienced it firsthand. Trauma like that can leave lasting scars. It's understandable that the parents would try to shield you from it. Definitely a difficult memory to carry. My father was just a rookie back then, almost 60 years ago. One cold winter morning, he and his partner were called to a trailer park by neighbors who were worried. A poor family had tried to heat their tiny home using the kitchen oven. The snow on the roof melted and froze again, sealing them in. When they finally forced the door open, the scene inside was horrific. The lifeless bodies of young children lay scattered across the floor alongside their father. The mother, lost to the effects of carbon monoxide, was on her hands and knees, desperately trying to scrub the vomit of her dead children from the floor. She didn't even seem to grasp the reality around her. My father had witnessed unimaginable horrors during World War II, from the beaches of Normandy to the ruins of Berlin. Yet, when I asked him about the worst thing he had ever seen, I never imagined he would tell me a story about a trailer park in New Jersey. That's a heavy story. It's shocking how situations can escalate in such dire ways. It's tough to reconcile experiences like that with life after war. Your dad probably carried a lot from those moments. It gives a different perspective on what people endure, even in seemingly normal places. It's a reminder of how fragile life can be and how quickly things can turn tragic. My anatomy professor used to work in an ER. He wasn't a doctor or a nurse, but one morning he witnessed something that still haunts him. A man stumbled in, his clothes torn, covered in dirt and blood, holding his shirt like a makeshift bag. The shirt was filled with something squishy, partially spilling out, as if he were trying to cradle a pile of Legos. This guy had driven himself to the hospital, disoriented and mumbling nonsense. But what they soon realized was far worse. His intestines were hanging out, partially in his shirt, partially still inside him. As they rushed him to surgery, they tried to piece him back together, stuffing what they could salvage back in place, but some parts weren't fit to keep. The story revealed itself during recovery. The man had been hunting alone, scaling a tree to reach a platform. Not a simple ladder, but those metal steps designed to grip your foot to keep you from slipping. Only he did slip, caught himself on that cruel hook step with his belly. After the fall, he lay there, the shock washing over him until he realized his insides were spilling out. With sheer willpower, he scooped up what he could and drove himself to the ER, a surreal act of desperation that left everyone in disbelief. That's a pretty wild story. The fact that the guy managed to drive himself to the hospital after that is something else. It's hard to imagine the level of shock and pain he must have been in. Getting his intestines back in sounds like quite an emergency. Hunting accidents can be serious, but this takes it to another level. Just thinking about it makes you appreciate how fragile things can be. My stepdad was a lieutenant detective in our small Midwestern town of about 25,000. He was assigned to a haunting case, a serial killer who, on his way through, stopped to tie up, assault, and brutally gut a 16-year-old girl in her own bed, right after school. Forensic teams swarmed the scene, but my stepdad remained in that bedroom with her lifeless body, grappling with the horror of it all. He had teenagers at home, and yet, he couldn't escape the gruesome reality. The killer didn't stop there. He traveled to Florida, where he did the same unspeakable thing to a 14-year-old girl. Back in the 80s, it took a long time to connect those two cases. Eventually, he was caught after shooting a police officer in Texas, and they sentenced him to death. For my stepdad, this was the case that defined his career, the one that would haunt him for the rest of his life. In the years that followed, he kept in touch with the girl's family, holding onto their grief with a tight grip. Just a few months ago, the case resurfaced on one of those true crime shows. They asked my stepdad to return to the police station, even after 20 years of retirement. He sifted through old documents and photos, each image a reminder of that tragic night. When he came home, he was teary-eyed and utterly drained, as if the past had jumped out to reclaim him, even after all these years. This story paints a heavy picture. It's tough to imagine the emotional toll on your stepdad, especially dealing with such a tragic case. The connection he maintains with the girl's family shows a level of humanity that's commendable. It's interesting to see how cases from the past can still affect people many years later. Returning to revisit those memories must have been intense for him. I once saw something that still haunts me. Picture this, a helmet, visor closed, just sitting on the highway like it was waiting for someone. It was 100 meters from a motorcycle, and another 50 further, the body, perfectly intact but without its head. I stared at the scene, trying to wrap my mind around it. How? Then it hit me. The rider had crashed, and his head got stuck between two steel lines on the roadside, severing it clean off his shoulders. The chilling part? His head was still trapped in that helmet. I stood there for what felt like a lifetime, debating whether to pick it up. Thank God I didn't. Ever since that day, I've sworn off anything with two wheels. That's pretty wild. Must have been a shock to see that on the road. Glancing at the helmet for so long without realizing what was inside is intense. It's good you didn't touch it. That kind of sight can stick with you. Avoiding two wheels after something like that makes sense. Can't blame you for staying away from motorcycles. Just a reminder of how quickly things can go wrong. She was just 19 when they brought her in. Skin charred, burns covering her entire body, the worst on her face. They had to intubate her for a month, her lungs and throat ravaged. Her boyfriend sat by her side, a picture of sorrow, claiming a stranger had done this unspeakable thing. But by week 3, it was clear she would survive. The moment they pulled out the breathing tube, though, he vanished. It turned out he was the monster she feared all along. Heartbroken, she'd ended things, and in a fit of rage, he doused her in gasoline and set her ablaze. That's some serious stuff. The betrayal is heavy, especially after being there for the initial crisis. It's wild how people can turn like that. You think you're close, then something like this happens. She deserves better, and hopefully, she can recover from all of this. It's hard to wrap your head around the actions of some people. My uncle, who used to work for the local sheriff's department, once shared a wild tale that left me stunned. One night, they received a call about a drunken woman they had dealt with before. But this time, things were different. The husband claimed she was armed and headed to her mother's house with the intent to harm their child out of spite. So, my uncle and a deputy sped off in pursuit, hoping to intercept her. They thought they were right on her tail, but somehow, she vanished into the dark, her headlights off. Just when they were beginning to doubt their instincts, the deputy's radio crackled with a report. She might have gone off the road. They backtracked and found her in a cow field, where she had careened down an embankment, taking out 2 cows in her path. But the real horror hit them when they reached the scene. 3 dead cows lay scattered, and the wrecked vehicle was a sight to behold. But then, just as they approached, the door of the car swung open. The woman stumbled out and began to hurl, her body entirely unsteady. It was then that the stench assaulted them. The last cow she hit had met its end right at her driver's side window. In a grotesque twist of fate, its insides had erupted, splattering the interior of her brand new car. There was cow guts everywhere. Seats, windows, the dashboard, even the vents, an absolute disaster. My uncle, horrified yet oddly amused, pulled rank and made the deputy take her into custody, the smell following them all the way back to town. That's quite a story. Sounds like a real chaotic night. It's pretty wild how things escalated from a simple intercept to a cow disaster. The whole situation with the drunk driver and the cows is just bizarre. Can't imagine the mess in that car. Definitely a memorable experience for your uncle and the deputy. It's one of those moments that you'd probably laugh about later, but not in the moment. My girlfriend's dad, a paramedic, once got a call about a mysterious smell coming from an apartment building. He arrived to find that an old man had died in his bathtub. No one cared enough to check on him, and he had been there for a week, rotting away in silence. It was summer, and of course the AC was off. The poor guy's torso had practically melted, turning into a grotesque goop that dripped into the water below. The terrible stench was coming from the building's awful ventilation system. It made me wonder, why did they call him before the cops? That's pretty grim. It's wild how people can just disappear and no one notices. The detail about the ventilation and the heat adds a whole other layer to it. Just shows how important it is to check in on folks, even those we might not think about regularly. But calling a paramedic first instead of the police is strange. Seems like a pretty unusual protocol.